Yes.
Wait, just to make sure, you guys aren't running a kit, right?
It's a little late to ask that.
Really? As I can mentally prepare myself, it's not about the
I mean, don't seem like 2 seconds.
Yeah. Before y'all start, can I get the resolution word for word, nice and slow? And can we stop the conversation in the room, please? We want to start the debate and get home.
For sure.
All right, so what's the res?
Word for word. USFG should implement a nationwide renewable portfolio standards to reach 100% renewable energy. Again, USFG should implement nationwide renewable portfolio standards, or RPS, to reach 100% renewable energy.
Portfolio standards?
It's nationwide renewable portfolio standards, RPS.
And then was there words after that?
Oh, yeah, to reach 100% renewable energy.
That's long. Okay, cool.
Okay, is everyone ready? First of all, congratulations to the teams for making it to finals. Awesome. Also to judges for staying good song. Okay, let's go.
Congrats.
As the resolution states, the United States federal government should implement nationwide renewable portfolio standards to reach 100% renewable energy. Let's go over a couple observations before we get to the plan. First observation is all definitions are contextual. We look towards RPS. They're basically requirements that are mandated, mandated on specifically the production of energy that's able to come out of specific companies, and that's like basically quotas. The second observation, this is a policy round because the word should in the resolution applies call to action. Therefore, we have to pass a policy and debate the implications of net benefits. Whichever team provides most solid welfare to the most value of people should win the round. The third observation is our plan text. The United States federal government will implement nationwide RPS, or renewable portfolio standards to reach 100% renewable energy. This is going to happen, this is going to be through normal means. The solvency, we're specifying our time frame right here. First of all, you can see that according to the IPCC, there's a 1.5 degree report that says that CO2 emissions must go to zero by 2050 in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change. And we're going to be explaining later on how RPS is going to be contributing to that, and that we slowly will increase the amount of percentages that are going until 100, and our time frame, by which we will reach that, is going to be 250. You can see that every couple of years, or every year, we can afford to increase that percentage by 5% if we start around 20 to 40, which is the ideal rate at which states who have passed their plan in the past have started out. Yes, question?
Just to specify, so basically by 2050 you'll be at 100.
Yes, that's the goal. And then I'm saying that every single year it is possible to go up by 5%. I'll explain this on the link level of the first advantage, which I will get to now. The first advantage is about global emissions. What's happening in the unique story is that currently there are no climate change standards that are ensuring the long-term stability by 2050 nationwide, even though there are a lot of policies that are happening on the state level. The A argument is that states such as California, there are 29 states specifically who are there are states right now that are trying to do as much as they can, including nonprofits and NGOs, but they cannot actually counteract the complete goals by 2050 for the entirety of the United States nation. This is according to National Geographic. But the B argument is that cap and trade policies are not implemented on a wide-scale level. You can see that Donald Trump is the head of the EPA, basically do not care about about a lot of the emission policies right now, which probably means that right now we need a plan to solve. But the B argument is that we're on a brink. You can see that only 29 states have adopted the RPS specifically, but according to National Geographic, the IPCC, and the UN Institute says that the United States is still behind because they would only have the capacity to fill up 45 to 50% of the entire nation's output for renewable energies by 2050, or at most at 80%, which means that we're never going to be able to reach this 100% benchmark that it has been stated that the IPCC has articulated as the deciding year in which we are unable to reverse its impact. But the link argument is that first of all, the RPS standards implemented for companies is able to resolve a lot of these issues. First of all, this requires specific percentage electricity that utilizes cell that will now come from renewable energy sources. You can see that this has been implemented in California, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, and Vermont. Their requirements right now, specifically in those states, are 50% or greater, and they can increase the percentages by around 5% each year. And every single year, you see slowly more and more states are adopting this. But this is not happening fast enough, especially in states that are more swing or more conservative, which probably means that we're not able to resolve any of the impacts unless we are able to pass the plan. But the second argument is that multiple studies claim that the plan is able to be solvent, especially with the current states that have this type of RPS. They are actually seeing major increases in the amount of renewable energy that they are able to transition to, seeing a direct decrease in the correlation, the amount of emissions that are causing a lot of the warming that is happening right now in the status quo. You can see here that climate reports that California, if they meet the 2050 standard goals, they actually have done, they probably can do that already by 2030 if they're still continuing with their current policies, which means we have links to our impacts. Our impacts is that, first of all, the scenario is that we're able to decrease global warming. There are a couple of implications. First of all, well that we're able to prevent the decrease of biodiversity. You see that 200,000 species specifically in the status quo are on the brink of literally being extinct, which probably is going to impact a whole bunch of cascade, a trophic cascade in which the one species going extinct will lead to a whole bunch of other ones going extinct, and pretty much we're not going to be having any food or water. This the second implication that emissions cause a whole bunch of ice melt. You can see that a whole bunch, like the continuum of emissions of CO2 emissions into the air causes a positive feedback loop, which releases methane into the air from these tundras when you're melting all the permafrost, which increases the amount of emissions that are happening. But this BC implication that coastal flooding creates things like climate refugees, where a whole bunch of people have to now suddenly move off the coast, and most of the people on the earth actually live in these climate refugees areas anyway, because you're displacing a whole bunch of people, especially people that are in poverty, who don't have the means necessary in order to move, which probably means that we have systemic impact over here. But this D argument is that we are able to decrease the carbon dioxide, which leads to things like ocean acidification, which leads to mass extinction. And the point of mass extinction is happening in the ocean. This also impacts things like fisheries and the economy, which means if we see decrease in the economy, we'll also see that kind of collapse going on. Yeah.
Pollution also kills people, especially those with
Oh yeah, global warming also. Wait, what?
Pollution kills individuals, especially those with.
Oh yeah, pollution also kills individuals, especially when they have like really bad asthma attacks or really bad respiratory diseases, in which we basically saw this happen when there were California fires. A whole bunch of people were not able to adapt to that and had to go to the hospital. So the second advantage is about transition. What's happening right now in the status quo is that renewable transitioning is not happening fast enough. So investments are dropping the renewable sector specifically for small businesses because they're not able to transition. The A argument is that this is expensive to build. A lot of it's expensive to build, even though that the prices are going down within the status quo. Small businesses specifically cannot adapt to the fact that there's $1,000 per kilowatt that natural gas plants have to take up. According to Bloomberg, their wind investments for small businesses specifically have been at an all year for the past 4 years has been an all-time low, which means that small companies are not able to adapt to this. So even though renewables are cheaper overall and are actually decreasing drastically the price in the status quo, small businesses are not actually incentivized to take on larger costs. According to CNBC, 39% of small business members are not confident that they can actually retire on the same plan, because of the fact that they're not able to adapt towards the climate change regulations, which means they cannot afford all these renewable energies. But the second argument is that the top companies are not enough to solve. You can see that according to the A argument is that Google and Apple are pushing for 100% renewables, but it is difficult to implement on medium-sized companies. According to Forbes, there are 250 small companies that want renewable energy opportunity to be spread, but there are no enforcement and no policies in order for them to get ahead of that. It's specifically bad in terms of swing states and conservative states who don't have those types of RPS bills passing in their legislation, which means that the plan is necessary to solve. The links is first of all that this is nationwide RPS. The A argument is that renewable commissions are able to help at the medium business level. For example, the Iowa Commission basically hosts a whole bunch of interventions where small companies are able to comply with RPS and are able to apply by their standards because they now have an actual management system that actually visits their areas to check on the fact of whether or not they're meeting their levels or not. But the B argument is that climate management systems enable benefits of the cost to be reached to smaller firms. And the second link is that this incentivizes investment. For example, there's a Lincoln Financial Group in California and Oregon that started hiring a whole bunch of workers for RPS, small corporate markets, and driving the transition even faster, which means that small companies are able to adopt the best benefits, and the impacts is that we are able to have a transition.
So I'll go over first two disadvantages of the counter plan, and then I'll go over app.
Give me a sec. I pulled you over to the dead side.
Yeah, dude.
The kill trees side.
I like having more.
Huh? Oh, yeah. I don't know.
Can't tell.
We're good.
Sweet. You said 2.
Two disadvantages of CP, and then there is.
Oh, so 3 feet. Okay, cool.
So is everyone in?
Yes.
We negate the resolution that the U.S. federal government should implement nationwide renewable portfolio standards to reach 100% renewable energy. I'll be calling it RPS from now on because that's super long. First is just some background. As they already stated, according to The Hill, 29 states have implemented RPS policies. As a result, there is a large body of research and evidence surrounding it. This data has actually turned out universally negative towards RPS. First, the disadvantage about cost. The uniqueness point 1 is according to the think tank Resources for the Future, RPS rarely lowered electricity costs, and it only did so in low requirements, about 3 to 7.5% of total electricity demands. Secondly, once the standard was 10%, over 10%, the electricity prices rose rapidly. Third point is according to the U.S. Department of the Interior, the average electric prices increased ranging from 3% to 11+%. That is the equivalent to paying one extra utility bill each year. The impacts of this is, according to the U.S. Energy Administration, 1 in 5 households have forgone basic necessities like food and medicine to pay energy bills. This specifically harms lower income individuals, and they are specifically harmed by this. This is really important because the burden of this is going to be falling on taxpayers, especially those who have to actually pay for this energy, because it's not just like, it's literally like what the energy companies and different companies have to like give to these consumers. So like they can't use oil and gas anymore that's really cheap, much cheaper, or natural gas. So that's especially going to be affecting these people as it has in the past. Also, poor individuals are uniquely harmed by climate change effects, such as living closer to the coast. They're more likely to be climate refugees, and it's much harder for them during extreme weather to recover from it and survive in it. So it turns basically any possible benefit to like the people within the United States, because the majority of people are going to be affected in this negative way. According to the professor at Michigan State University, RPS policies cost an average of 18.6 times more than a broad portfolio that includes carbon neutral and carbon negative technologies. Also, according to Renoke University, the presence of RPS policy has negatively and significantly, what does that even say? Oh, like harmed, harmed the percent change in GDP, so basically a significant negative decrease in the GDP. The impact of that is literally everyone in the United States suffers. There's an increase of poverty as well as other things that come from our economy shrinking. Also, another impact is backlash, as we've already seen with like very extreme policies that happen for climate change. For example, in France, when the poor people are affected, it leads to riots and actually harm to not only like the government, but people like in the United States who are rioting and stuff like that. It's like not that far-fetched now that we've gotten so fast, that like these people will actually be so upset that that will lead to strife within America, which would be really, really bad.
Yeah, you said that there are currently a whole bunch of 29 states, and I agree with this, but do you have examples of this violence and rioting that's actually happening?
Well, no, but if it's on a nation...
The standard that they're setting is way higher.
Yeah, the standard that you're setting is much higher than any of the states currently are. As you stated in the status quo, there's no way that they can pretty much get past 50%, much less 100%. So like comparing those two like isn't, like you're literally doubling all the standards and putting them into states that literally hate renewable energy. Like a bunch of states are still reliant on coal like 90% of the time. So like there's no way that those the status quo like has those impacts. The second, so basically, yeah, affects the poor disproportionately, and it harms GDP, which affects everybody, and there's also backlash that could lead to political violence. And that especially affects like lower income people. So our second disadvantage about how this like technology is literally just ineffective. The first uniqueness point here is, according to the Journal of Energy Economy in 2018, RPS are much less effective at reducing carbon emissions because they only incentivize renewable energy. This leaves out carbon negative technology such as DAC. It leaves out nuclear technology because that's carbon negative. It leaves out pretty much everything that isn't wind, solar, or waves because those are the only renewable technologies that are actually feasible. Also, the second point here is, according to the Department of Interior, again, only a minuscule emissions reduction actually occurred because of RPS. They actually haven't given you like much of the impacts of how these have happened in the 29 states in a positive manner, and the impacts of this is it's never actually going to get past this it's never going to get to the point of the 2050 brink where like this renewable energy will actually have any positive impact, although they didn't really define how renewable energy is actually going to help that brink. And with that, that's going to like basically increase the effects of climate change because they have no way to actually fix it by that brink. But that brink is even sooner, and that brings us into our counterplan. Our counterplan is the U.S. federal government should not implement national renewable portfolio standards to reach 100% renewable energy, and instead require carbon negative and carbon neutral technology development nationally. The U.S. federal government should not... Oh, you want to just write down? The U.S. federal government should not implement national renewable portfolio standards to reach 100% renewable energy, and instead require carbon negative and carbon neutral technology development nationally. So basically what's happening here is carbon negative technology, this is the solvency, carbon negative technology is like any technology that reduces our carbon footprint to less than neutral. So basically the net effect is removing CO2 from the atmosphere. These technologies include direct air capture, carbon sequestration, carbon recycling, etc. These, especially like DAC, has been around for literally like 40 years, and it's actually having a really good impact. We just need to like have more people use it. Carbon negative technology uniquely solves for climate change because its most devastating impacts to avoid its most devastating impacts, we must be carbon negative by 2030. That is the actual brink in the scenario. We must be carbon negative by 2030 to avoid the most detrimental effects of climate change, because that will reduce or keep our temperature rise at 1.5 degrees Celsius instead of 2. I'm sorry, I don't have enough time. So basically, this is the brink, and that is the most catastrophic immediate effects of climate change. So even if you don't believe our counterplan, believe that the brink is actually sooner, and there's no way that the affirmative can solve in any world, because climate change, their renewable energy project would only happen ideally by 2050. So with that, let's go into their first advantage. They talk about global emissions. They pretty much talk about how it sucks right now. Yeah, we agree. There's no way that the status quo is good. But they stated cap and trade, for example. Yeah, cap and trade sucks, but you don't actually solve those issues. They gave no pretty much benefit to renewable energy. They just said, oh, renewable energy good, but we actually need a benefit when there are other technologies that actually do this better. Also, they said these are they're also the CP solves significantly better for this, and the brink is significantly earlier, so they can't actually solve in any world. You have to get to them. So also they said that there's specific electric percentages, cross supply, or think about cost. This is actually going to harm the people it's supposed to help, because it's going to increase the amount of electricity spending that we have in the United States. And that's going to be really, really bad, and that's going to outweigh any possible impact that they didn't even talk about for renewable energy, because these people are literally going to be rioting in the streets about this. They said they're solving because it's decreasing reductions. They're not making a carbon negative footprint, and as we already stated, and as most scientists agree, carbon negative is literally the only way we're going to avoid dying from climate change. If we don't do that, if we literally just go, oh, look, solar now, but ignore all the carbon in the air, then it's not going to work. So their impacts about global warming, very fleshed out. They have no link between renewable energy and saying how renewable energy is actually key, because they're not actually decreasing carbon in a negative way. They're just kind of making it less. In the most ideal sense, if they even get to 2050. So their second contention about the transition, their only impact here is just there's a transition. A transition can happen with any technology. It doesn't have to be specifically this plan to have a transition, so it's completely not unique. But also their CP solves for this, obviously, because we need this transition can happen because these technologies have literally existed for over 40 years, specifically direct air capture. Also, they said it's going to be expensive. It's currently expensive in small business. Completely turn this argument that it's going to be incredibly expensive for small business to do their plan because of the electricity costs we talked about in our first disadvantage. Also, they said they talked about more small businesses. They're literally destroying small businesses with this, as we've already seen with the electricity costs, and their impacts of it being nationwide. They're literally not making it any better, and renewable energy doesn't solve. So for all those reasons, vote nay.
Where's my black pen? There it is. How do I do that?
What do you guys want to text with Campolindo?
I got it.
Oh, you mean done?
Yeah.
Maybe after.
I'm good.
You want it?
Okay.
Also, can I clarify here? Because the reason I wrote with your timeline, I wasn't exactly
Wait,
sure when
okay.
you were
Oh,
starting.
wait.
When were you starting? Because there's a 5% increase, I know that, but I wasn't sure what standard you were
So
starting
your
from.
text is different. It says with the AF timeline and increases.
Is this
Right.
the final text?
Wait, give that back.
Yeah, so,
It
okay,
says
so,
it's
no,
not
the
like-
reason is because I was unclear what you, you were unclear with where you're starting, you said 20 to 40% is where you were, that's where you're
Well, I'm just asking what your counter plan is. I know what my plan is.
I don't know what conversation's happening here, but I think I'm gonna put a stop to it since we don't got
Probably
flex.
it's not a textual event.
Yeah.
Move on.
Order, please.
This has CP case.
Wait. Oh, okay. So, where's my other disaggregate? There it is. Hold up. Cool dance. Ready when you are.
Time starts now. Let's start right off with the disadvantage about the cost. On the uniqueness level, they talk about how RPS is rarely lower cost. The first argument here is that there's actually absolutely no reason why the status quo is good. If you take a quick look at the counterplan, they don't actually decrease the RPSs that currently exist on the state level, which means in the world of the counterplan, it's pretty much the same world as the status quo in which RPS exists on the state level, which means if they are true and RPSs are expensive, that means they're not able to solve for that. But secondarily, there's several reasons why RPSs are not expensive at all. The first reason is that it's empirically denied. You can look towards the fact that states with RPSs, in total, they actually added only 1.3% to consumption consumer bills, but in comparison, dependence on fossil fuels for energy has actually caused fluctuations that increase bills by up to 8.5%, which is an indication that transitioning now is always going to be better in comparison to using fossil fuels. You can look towards the fact that the lack of renewables causes high costs to occur now. The only reason why RPSs might be linked to higher costs is because there wasn't a full transition, which means we need the affirmative plan to have the full transition in order to lower costs completely. The second response is that you can look towards a new report that was just released recently on all state RSPs or RPSs combined, released by the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and the National Energy Lab, that found that the economic benefits for consumers average $7.2 billion in consumer returns, which significantly outweighs any sort of compliance cost, which is less than $1 billion, which means, once again, all the consumer benefits are going to outweigh. The third answer here is that there's simply no link. You can look towards the fact that in states that have been doing RSP since 1983, like Iowa, like my partner articulated, they have all these commissions that are able to check back for costs because they're able to do outreach programs and actually work with small businesses to make sure they're not collapsing due to cost, which means the affirmative plan is able to solve. The fourth answer to cost is going to be that of California. You can look towards the fact that California implemented a plan that is very similar to the one we're expanding nationwide, which means that if California did not see an increase in cost, which we already argue that they have not in the second advantage, then they're not going to be seeing those increases in costs when the affirmation plan passes across the entire United States. The fifth response here is that renewable energy is getting cheaper anyway, which means any momentary increase in price is going to be leveled out as time passes on. The warrant for this is that the growth of wind and solar and other renewable energies driven by mandates would actually lead up to $1.2 billion in reduced electricity costs, according to the same LBNL study, which means in a world in which the plan passes, it would actually incentivize decreased electrical costs in the future, which means that the plan solves. Furthermore, you can look towards the fact that solar prices are going to drop by 65% by 2025 anyway, which indicates that any costs now will be negligible in the future and significantly outweigh any sort of reliance on fossil fuels. Next, let's go to the impact level. Oh, actually, real quick on their warrants. They talk about all these U.S. Department of Interior projections about 3 to 11%, but you should prefer our meta-analyses over all existing 29 RSPs that are currently in place and all the projections that will happen in the future, because you have to look towards future prices to predict future costs. Let's go to the impact level. They talk about 1 in 5 households forego food. The first argument here is that this is the status quo, which means there's no articulated difference for what would happen when the plan passes, which means you don't have a unique impact. Additionally, they don't actually directly attribute the fact that 1 in 5 households can't afford food in place of utilities to RPS in the first place. There are a lot of alternative causes to poverty that are not linked to RPS, which means they have no quantifiable impact to our plan. Next, they make this argument about how our RPS policies would cost 18.6 times more than a broad portfolio. The first argument here is that they don't actually explain what a broad portfolio is, so there's no actual comparative analysis that you can make there. But secondarily, we'd argue that a plan is broad because we expand the amount of renewable energy that can be created when we encompass all of the entire United States and take into account all the independent state policies that have occurred, which means they're probably able to resolve this. Next, they kind of have another impact about poverty or something, but they have not proven that there's a link between GDP and poverty. And once again, we argue that the plan uniquely decreases consumer costs based on all the warrants that I just read. Next, they make this backlash argument. I'm not sure if this is still on the impact level. The first argument here is that there's no backlash from the status quo. As my partners articulated, we are following the California model, which indicates that we're able to resolve backlash if there's no backlash in California. But secondarily, you can look towards the fact that there's no higher standards being suddenly implemented. So if they try to go for the conservative states backlash argument, it doesn't matter because we're only increasing by 5% a year. Additionally, they've conceded all our analysis that shows that commissions are working together with small businesses, which means that pro-business conservative states are still going to see employment increases, which means they're going to be able to placate the public no matter what. The third response here is that any sort of backlash from coal and mining districts is going to be inevitable in a world where coal is a dying industry. The energy sector in fossil fuels is literally slowing down right now. You can look towards the fact that Forbes predicts that there's going to be slowing oil production and closing of mines. The only reason they haven't closed yet is because Trump's artificially propping up the industry, which means they're unable to solve. Let's go on to the second disadvantage about technology being inefficient. They make this argument about how it's less effective and the only incentive is renewable energy. The first argument here is that incentivizing renewable energy is always going to be the prerequisite to becoming carbon negative in the first place. Sucking out a bunch of carbon from the atmosphere doesn't matter when you have giant corporations continuously putting more carbon into the atmosphere, which means you're never going to be able to go carbon negative without a permanent transition. We solved the root cause, they just solved the symptom. But the second response here is that they talk about how there are only a minuscule decrease in emissions, but they have conceded our California warrant about how they're able to reach emission goals they will be able to reach emission goals by 2030 instead of 2050, which means they're drastically improving the rate at which emissions go down. You should buy our empirical analysis over theirs because it's more specific. Secondarily, this is only defensive. There's no actual offensive arguments here. Next, on the link level, they talk about how we're unable to fix it and the brink is sooner. The first argument is that the brink doesn't matter. It's a question of linearity. Global warming is linear. Any minor increase in temperature will lead to more deaths by coastal flooding and more deaths by biodiversity loss, which indicates that the brink doesn't matter. It's just a question of how we resolve it. But secondarily, again, this is defense. Let's move on to the counterpoint. First argument is the counterplan is perm do the plan in all non-competitive parts of the counterplan. Perm do the plan in all non-competitive parts of the counterplan. This is going to be able to function because we're still able to do RSPs and also invest money in required carbon negative technologies. It means we're able to solve the entirety of the second disadvantage anyway, because the second disadvantage is about how we're inefficient. But if we can also increase carbon negative technology is not an opportunity cost of the plan, which means it's not a reason to go down the affirmation. The second response here is that you can just extend our analysis for our renewables and internally to carbon negative technology. Second response to the counterplan is that your counterplan doesn't actually take away the state originating RSP policy or the RPS policies, right? Which means that their counterplan doesn't actually solve for the first disadvantage anyway, because in a world in which states have their own policy, that still means that cost will be an issue if you buy the cost disadvantage, which means the counterplan is still probably going to be biting the cost disadvantage if the cost is true, which we've proven it's not. The third reason are a couple of reasons why the counterplan is independently bad. The first reason is that the counterplan doesn't actually have quotas. If you look at the counterplan, they just say that they're going to implement standards that allow for carbon neutral sources. They don't provide any requirements, they don't provide any restriction, which means there's absolutely no obligation for states to follow through. There's no obligation for companies to follow through, which means there's absolutely no guarantee that their plan will be able to solve. The second argument here is that they isolate nuclear technology as like carbon negative or carbon neutral. This is specifically bad because reliance on nuclear energy often leads to nuclear waste and dumping. You can look towards Yucca Mountain, in which nuclear waste is deposited on indigenous populations, which means that you have to look towards our renewables first before theirs. The third response is that carbon sequestration is specifically bad. They themselves articulate that it has existed for 40 years. Well, if it has existed for 40 years and the brink is 2030, then you're definitely not going to be able to solve. But furthermore, you can look towards the fact that carbon sequestration has been linked to earthquakes because the way they store carbon underground often damages infrastructure, which means it's uniquely bad. Let's move on to the affirmative case. On to the first advantage about emissions. Everything on the affirmative case is a cross-application of the next case, which means if I've already answered it, there's absolutely no reason why the affirmative case is not true. You can send all of our uniqueness about how the standards don't exist right now, which means we need an emissions decrease now, which will happen sooner than your carbon technology development will actually happen. So when you talk about how the counterplan solves the brink and increased electrical spending is going to outweigh, we've already shown that any sort of the economic benefits from implementing this portfolio are going to outweigh any marginal increase in electrical bills. And additionally, you can just extend our analysis of renewables are the internally having carbon negative technology in the first place, which is the access to the prerequisite, which means we have directly shown that decreasing emissions leads to a decrease in global warming, which means you get to solve for all the impacts that we are going for that they have completely conceded. Let's go into the second advantage about transition. We talk about the plan to destroy small businesses. The first argument is that there's no warrant to decreasing small businesses. They've conceded all the warrant debate about how these commissions exist to allow the transition to happen smoothly, which their counterplan does not do, so it's a unique solvency deficit. But second of all, you can look towards the fact that the federal policy is a barrier. Business wanted transition. Now the only thing stopping is that no nationwide consolidated RSP exists, which means you need the plan in order to have small businesses succeed. For these reasons, I would ask.
Set the writing.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I'm going to start on the perm, and then the responses on the counterplan flow, and then neg and ask. Is everyone ready? 3, 2, 1, start now. Okay, so first on the perm, they say that these are not mutually exclusive. These are mutually exclusive. You look at the fact that inside of the text we say that the timeline is 2030. They say specifically that they are trying to stop it before the brink that they specified, which is 2050. You clearly cannot do both of these things if you're trying to reach 100% by different timelines. Those are completely different policies. They're trying to achieve different things, and they're also requiring on different standards. Protected time.
There's no protected time this turn.
Okay, well then I still won't take it because I have a lot to get through. I'll take it at the end of the perm bit. Okay, so the first thing that they say is there's no quotas or anything. Okay, first of all, the quota is literally within the text. It's by 2030. It's an incremental increase. If you divide the amount to get to 2030, the amount of years by the actual percent you need to get there, that's the amount, the incremental that's going to increase. That's obvious. You're just increasing to 2030. That is the quota. They're just trying to misrepresent our plain text. Okay, on the second part about how nuclear energy is specifically bad and how they're dumping waste. Okay, first of all, nuclear energy is not specifically bad. There are a couple responses. First of all, it's a steady supply of energy, and it's also a lot cheaper and more a lot more reliable than all these other sorts of renewable energy. It's also a lot more powerful. It can provide a lot more energy for a lot more people. It's a lot more advanced than solar and wind and geothermal and stuff like that. And also, it's a lot more established in the status quo, so it's a lot easier. And that specifically shows why our plan is good, because it's allowed to incentivize that instead of just renewable energies. Additionally, it's completely non-unique, because you were seeing that all this dumping that's happening is already happening in the status quo. So why is what we're doing even any worse? On the third point, I talked about renewable is first to the carbon. Renewable is the priority to get to carbon negative. Yeah, renewable is important, but it's not the first thing. And if you make it the only priority, as we're going to talk about later on with my disadvantages, what you're going to see is that it's actually going to cause backlash. It's going to lead to a stalling of the process that it's trying to do in the first place. A sensible approach is having a mix that allows us, a mix of carbon neutral, carbon negative, lots of stuff, nuclear, that allows us to actually address the problem and not go to a point where we're going to cause negative impacts. Okay, so now onto the CP. So they talk about how this only added 1.3% to consumer bills. Okay, the most important point on our warrants is that this Department of the Interior cards and this whole study is not predicting. It's not in the future. This is literally an analysis of the 29 states that I talked about. And it added from the very lowest end 3% to consumer bills to 11% at the most. What they're doing is they're increasing by an order of, not by an order, by like 2 times, 3 times the amount that these people are paying and these quotas. So what you're going to see is that's going to be a lot more than just 11%. It's going to be 22%, 33%. And actually, we have a specific card from Professor Shelley at Michigan State saying that what happens is when you go above 10%, it starts increasing even more rapidly, right? Why is this happening? The logic is this. The price of renewable is decreasing, but the problem is it's not decreasing even close to fast enough to catch up to fossil fuels. That's the reason people use fossil fuels. It's because they're significantly cheaper and it's a business benefit. What's going to happen is when you force them to switch to renewable energy, it doesn't matter whether you have commissions or anything. They have to pay the price for that energy. And as a result, you're going to see these massive increases in price. There is no response to the fact that when we have a specific statistic saying that what will happen is that you'll have to pay at least, in the status quo, they're paying an extra energy bill a year. When you double or triple this, they're paying 2 or 3 extra. What you see is that we have a specific terminalized impact from the U.S. Energy Administration saying that 1 in 5 families forgo basic necessities to pay an energy bill. When you're having them forgo basic necessities like food and medicine for 2-3 energy bills, and you're getting this price rising exponentially, what you're going to see is a rapid decrease in quality of life. And even more importantly, what you're going to see is the backlash argument. Okay, that is the most important thing in today's debate. We're on, sorry, I'm on the first dissent now. We're talking about the backlash. Here's the links. What we're going to see is like, is when these prices go up, you'll see in the precedent in France right now, it was the exact same situation. They tried to pass very radical economic policy to force people to pay a lot of money for the gas tax. But what happened, instead of this massive radical change, was actually backlash. Now they're having to repeal all this thing, and they're going to have 5 to 10 year setbacks. That's what's going to happen in their world. When you're increasing exponentially the amount that people are having to pay, they are not just going to take it, because they cannot. They're going to rebel. There's going to be backlash. Whether it's violence in the streets, which it has shown to be in other countries and in the past, it's going to be political change. It's going to be backlash. It's going to be people not voting for candidates. That's what we're going to see. The only way to actually create real change is to make it sustainable. That's the most important thing. Okay, now, so back on the counterplane, when they talk about all this stuff about how the lack of renewables, which causes high costs now, once again, exactly, renewables are simply more expensive, and they can see this in their own case. And that's the exact point as to why you have to do the counterplan, because we include other technologies that are not just renewable, including nuclear, including allowing people to use stuff like direct air capture and other technologies that are not just about using expensive renewable energy that decimates the economy. Okay, then again, they keep bringing up this thing that RPS has had commissions. Okay, commissions might help people deal with it, but it's not going to deal with the fact that these are actually raw costs. Like, you can't literally decrease the cost that someone has to pay for something. And that is a fact, that is at a certain level, and in the affirmative world, that is increasing exponentially when they're trying to increase it 5% over the timeline that they're talking about. Okay, now going down to talk about $7.2 billion in consumer returns. They completely dropped the card where we talk about the Roanoke University saying that there's a significant correlation to negative GDP percent change. So when you see that this is causing $7.2 billion in consumer returns, if you have a negative percent change in the GDP, that's going to outweigh on a nationwide scale easily. Again, they talk about how California does not have collapses. Yeah, what they are doing is the brink. They are making this much more radical and much more intense than it ever has been, and no one can possibly handle this. Again, they talk about how renewables is getting cheaper. Already responded to that. Talk about how solar is going to drop by 65%. Still not cheaper than anything else. Yeah.
Also, like that's just solar energy in general. There's nothing to do with RPS.
Yeah, exactly. That's just solar energy. That's nothing to do with RPS. It's not going to. They provide no links as to why they make that better or to why that matters in terms of actually reducing the energy prices. Okay, so now back onto the first disadvantage. They talk about how this is how it's in the status quo that 1/5 of people forgo basic necessities. No, that is the status quo, but they are making it much significantly worse. They're making people pay extra energy bills through which they'll have to forgo more basic necessities like food and medicine. Again, so now on the point about how we don't explain what a broad portfolio is, our counter plan is a broad portfolio. We are saying that these quotas and the percent of energy that has to be required by companies within the state can include carbon neutral and carbon negative technologies to make up for that. That is what the broad portfolio is, according to these reports from Michigan State. That is what it is. And it's 18.6 times less expensive to include things like nuclear energy, to include things like direct air capture, to include methods such as that within the actual RPS, and to not just have it be renewable energy. That is what the broad portfolio is. Yeah.
Also, just real quick about Brinks, they said Brinks don't matter, but their whole thing is about how they want to get to something by 2050.
Yeah,
somehow Brinks.
Yeah, and the whole point about like climate change being linear and the whole Brinks, like their entire thing, like they said in their uniqueness that there's a brink by 2050, and now it's suddenly linear. They just realized that we're doing it faster and better than them, and so it's clear that we're actually the ones that are saving anyone if there is a brink. And as my partner brought up, which is on the future, the brink is 2030. Okay, so now onto the point about the ineffective thing about how commissions are working. Once again, commissions can't deal with literal raw costs, and additionally, commissions cannot be replicated just from a single Ohio instance to be nationwide and coordinating nationwide with the federal government or anything. There's no way you can replicate that scale. Additionally, they talk about incentivizing renewable energy is super important. Once again, incentivizing renewable energy in this manner simply creates backlash. And again, they talk about how we concede the California impact. We concede that right now there's not violence. Because what they are doing is they are increasing what everyone is going to have to pay by an insane amount. Thank you.
So do a quick overview, just a couple sentences. And I'll go into the CP and fade into two villages. Is that right?
Your video.
Overview, just a couple sentences. CP, two voter issues. Okay. Is that right? Start my time now. At the point where the affirmative does not do enough to meet the brink at 2030 and the cost outweighs the benefit of renewable energy, you will be voting nay. First, on the counterplan, they completely dropped our entire analysis, as my partner extended, that carbon negative technology uniquely solves for climate change's most devastating impacts because when we meet carbon negative technology quotas by 2030, we keep the global temperature at 1.5 degrees Celsius. Again, they cannot perm because these goals are in two completely separate things, so doing the plan wouldn't actually do anything. Like, they can't prove that their plan is good when literally ours is the only one that is benefiting anything. Also, we already stated that there's the disadvantages to the plan are disadvantages to the perm. So it being 18.6 times more expensive than any carbon negative technology means that you should be not voting for the perm because they literally can't do both, especially when our plan text literally states that we're not doing both. So now, we uniquely solve. They literally just drop all our analysis talking about how literally carbon negative technology is the unique solvent for this. A broad portfolio, as my partner specified in his last speech, and I actually said in my first speech, a broad portfolio includes negative, neutral, carbon negative technology, and we actually do that. Their only real piece of offense on this is maybe it hurts indigenous people, but that's non-unique. That happens in the status quo anyway.
Any argument that responds to our disadvantage about you making it worse by putting waste into indigenous population land has not been responded to in the MO.
I said specifically in my response to the perm, because that is my second response, saying that the nuclear impacts are non-unique because it's having a subject. I said that specifically.
Yeah.
It's a panel.
Okay. But anyway, we still went on the CP because you didn't counter that we're literally uniquely solving it. It's the key to solving climate change. So now let's go into basically the first voter, which is the effects on the poor and just the general populace of both climate change and cost. First, just extend our analysis that 1 in 5 people forgo medicine and food for electricity bills, and these electricity bills are uniquely increasing, and especially when the GDP is literally shrinking by such a big percentage, you must be voting for us on impacts to the poor, because their only response to this is, oh, there's no link between GDP and people being poor. Is that a joke? My partner completely, just extend all my partner's responses about that. that, and how like literally poor people are paying extra energy bills because of this GDP decrease. So that could completely outweighs like anything that they talk about of consumer returns. Also, they have not proven why, like this still reigns true, they have not proven why renewable energy is uniquely key to solving climate change. This has been a key theme throughout the whole thing. They say, oh, let's do it by 2050. They literally say like the brink is 2050, but they don't tell you how renewable energy solves for 2050. They just say, oh, we're going to get there and it's going to be good. But at the point where we disprove that renewable energy is the like prerequisite to these carbon negative technologies, because they're literally two completely different systems, both are good, but like they don't have to like rely on each other, then you shouldn't be voting for their plan, because they literally haven't explained to you how renewable energy helps anything. They literally say, oh, well, if we do it by 2050, things will be good, but they have no sources stating that by doing it by 2050, we're going to magically reverse all the effects of climate change. And at the point where like they draw, at the point where they admit that like they can't perm because of timelines and the disadvantages to the perm, like we're literally the only side that like that does like for climate change. Also, like even if you don't believe that, like we have the unique advantage of backlash, or disadvantage of backlash, like if anything else becomes being a wash, like who solves climate change and who doesn't. The only unique impact left in this round is backlash. They specifically didn't counter any of our evidence talking about, for example, the Yellow Jacket riots in France, how when they tried to do such an aggressive behavior for renewable energy, that it actually created strife and like literally hundreds of people dying from these riots, and creating political strife within a country like ours is not a good thing, and they literally haven't countered these impacts at all. That political strife is extremely negative and possibly outweigh any of those impacts, because it'll especially affect like states that are more conservative and still rely on coal. And as my partner already stated, it will literally halt all like climate change things, because like states like West Virginia and other swing states like they talked about literally don't currently rely on any renewable energy. Like they're mostly coal and petroleum. So at that point, when we see this backlash and these riots are actually going to be halting those initiatives, we see that they're not actually going to be solving by 2050, and they're not going to be solving for literally anything. So at the points where the perm falls, our counterplan is uniquely key to solving. We have the unique impact of backlash that they literally have never responded to. Under net benefits, we must not risk doing the affirmative plan, raising costs astronomically, and you must vote nay.
In order?
Yeah. Order is going to be the first advantage, the counter plan, and then the two dissects. Everyone ready? The overview is that the counterplan cannot solve for the first advantage, specifically because they have no arguments for why the status quo is able to resolve all of these current states not able to transition fast enough. That means that the status quo cannot solve right now, which means it's only a risk that the affirmative can resolve for the issue of emissions. They specifically cannot solve for emissions. I would get onto that in the counterplan later, but there are a couple of reasons for why we are their internal link to any of their case. First of all, that we are able to decrease costs within the future. They can see all of our warrant arguments, or link arguments about how California, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York have all made requirements 15% and over, and they've seen a direct decrease in the amount of costs that are going to be paneling out within the future. You can also extend Sharon's response over here about how this is massively better than using fossil fuels, because their fossil fuels cost 8.5% higher in terms in comparison to the RPS, which is 1.3%, which probably means at the point where they can see the specific analysis, you can see that decreasing costs within the future is going to be able to outweigh any of their arguments about how electricity bills are going to be increasing. But second of all, they can see the fact that coal is dying anyways within the status quo, which means it's only a question of whether or not we can decrease emissions by actually creating quotas. They can see that their counterplan does not resolve for the fact that the RPS standards is the internal link to their counterplan, because this creates quotas, right? You can extend my 1A link argument, how this requires specific percentage electricity from companies that have to come from renewable sources. The point where there are no quotas at all from their counterplan, that means that only the affirmative can resolve for this advantage. But third of all, you can see that any economic benefits are going to be outweighing any type of electricity bills, because they have not specifically articulated for why the GDP growth is going to be specifically linking to poverty. Well, we have specific impacts about how in these states, if we are seeing a direct decrease in emissions, this directly decreases the amount of like global warming that is going to happen. They can see it on the entirety of our impact block, which means that we're going to be outweighing in terms of coastal flooding and biodiversity. It's going to be happening right now within the status quo, which probably means at the point where they have no articulation for why global warming is being solved right now in the status quo, you have to be voting for these impacts. You can, and which means in terms of probability, we're always going to be more probable because they can see all of our words for how in those 29 states it was been able to be implemented, and they saw direct decreases in emissions, which means it's only a question of it being implemented to the entirety of the United States. But second of all, we outweigh on magnitude. If we do this in terms of the entire population for the entire national state, which means we're probably going to be having more solvency than the counterplan, because the third of all is that they concede the time frame analysis about how if all of their arguments on the counterplan have been existent, all their technology existent for 40 years, that probably means that we need a change from the status quo. Their counterplan literally is the status quo if it has been implemented for 40 years.
The argument that our counterplan is literally the status quo is completely new analysis that you've never seen before.
The specific wording that the counterplan is the status quo might be new, but in my MGS specifically said that your carbon sequestration technology has existed for 40 years and we haven't seen it solve climate change, which means it
Yeah,
won't
sure.
solve.
I'm just saying the squo part is...
Okay,
then
I'll concede that, and I'll just say, like, sure, you won't solve 40 years. I don't think it really matters. Okay, so we're still able to solve for time frame because of the fact that if we've been trying, if these technologies have been existing for 40 years, that means we necessarily need RPS in order to ensure that those carbon levels are actually at a quota. Remember that carbon sequestration and carbon negative, they may say that they want to go carbon negative, but it doesn't actually enforce anything, which means you need the plan to create set quotas that RPS, that's literally the definition of RPS, which probably means we have direct access to our impacts over here. Let's go into the counterplan. The overview is that the permutation is able to solve. Their counterplan does not solve with their own disadvantage, which means you have to go for the affirmative. Let's go to reasons for why the counterplan is able to work. First of all, you can see that brinks don't necessarily matter. It's only a question of who is able to solve right now from the SCASO and create a necessary transition, which means that 2030, 2050, it doesn't really matter. But second of all, you should not buy their analysis because 2030, they literally provided no source for that information, and there's absolutely no backup for it.
The argument that we didn't provide a source for this brink is completely new.
Okay, I don't think that really matters, so sure. What? Oh, yeah, okay, what?
We can do the carbon negative by 2030.
Yeah, that's my next argument. The second argument is that it's not mutually exclusive. We can go carbon negative by 2030. But at the same time, we can create RPS standards by 2050, which means that there's absolutely no reason for why their counterplan is competitive whatsoever, which means that there's absolutely no disadvantage to our counterplan. The third reason for why the permutation works is simply because they expand carbon sequestration. It's not a guarantee that by 2030 they can solve, which means necessarily the plan is the internal link to ever having the impacts of their counterplan, which means that there's no solvency unless you have specific quotas, which means the plan is able to outweigh because you're ensuring long-term transitions. They also concede all the disadvantages about how there's nuclear technology that will be preventing nuclear waste. They try to say this is non-unique. This is literally not non-unique. There's no articulation for why it's non-unique. You can see here that the carbon sequestration, if they were necessarily to increase that is going to be losing massive amounts of indigenous populations' land, which is going to be increasing the amount of deaths. But second of all, they concede that carbon sequestration leads to earthquakes, which means that you increase the amount of global warming, which means that your counterplan can never solve because there's conceded offense on this counterplan. They cannot win it. They concede all four disadvantages of the counterplan, which means even if they buy that they can pass their portfolio, they've conceded all of the disadvantage, which means that even if they have quotas, they've conceded the disad, which means you vote out. Let's go into their disadvantages. Overview, they concede that any marginal increase in cost now any marginal increase now is outweighed by the fact that it will decrease in the future. They can see the warrant 1.3% versus 8.5% in terms of possible, which means that we outweigh in terms of time frame. Our solvency short circuits any types of disadvantages. Also, that you should prioritize future projections over current numbers because it's a question of probability. Where extensioners arguments about how we have to look towards these statistics first because there's no direct cause and effect between RPRs and GDP. They've not specifically linked GDP to a decrease in poverty. There's no terminalized impact over here, which means they have absolutely no link. You cannot give them access to their impacts when you vote out.
Should we leave?
Get out of here.
Oh, okay.